This is OTR FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Welcome to Cracked, the podcast, the program that slays the dragons of mental health by stripping away the shame, embarrassment, fear, and stigma. Because mental health isn't something that affects just some of us, it applies to all of us. Here to shine a new light on areas of mental health that often go unvisited are your hosts, Rebecca Shaper and Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome to Cracked, the podcast, Slaying the Dragons of Mental Health with me, Sandy Sedgbeer.
And me, Rebecca Shaper.
Over 40 years ago, Paul Levy had a life-transforming spiritual awakening that was misdiagnosed as a psychotic break. Repeatedly hospitalized and told he was mentally ill, the abuse he sustained from psychiatry destroyed his family and almost killed him. But over time, he extricated himself from psychiatry and continued to unfold and integrate his awakening. And in a sweet turnaround, he now has psychiatrists consulting him. A Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and founder of the Awakening in the Dream community in Portland, Oregon, Paul Levy is a noted pioneer in the field of spiritual emergence. He's also a teacher, healer, artist, and author of several mind-blowing books that explore the nature of madness, evil, psychological and emotional abuse, the projection of the shadow self, and the existence of a mind virus that is at the root of every crisis we're facing today, but which, once recognized, can help humanity wake up and bring sanity back to our society. Paul Levy, welcome.
Hi, I'm just so happy to be here with you guys. Thank you so much.
Paul, your book, Awakened by Darkness, When Evil Becomes Your Father, shares the harrowing story of the extreme psychological and emotional abuse you received from your emotional, disturbed father who carried a virus known as watico and projected it on to you. Would you share what happened to you in 1981 as a result of that trauma?
Yeah, for sure. So to create context, I was, in my childhood, I was a happy, healthy kid. And I was the only child. And my father, one way of understanding him, the way he dealt with his unhealed abuse was instead of self-reflecting, was just to act it out on the next of kin, which was me. And so many people do that. And so he unwittingly had become an instrument for really archetypal evil to enact itself through him. And being a sensitive kid, I was the recipient of that abuse. So it went from me being a happy, healthy, very accomplished kid to being so overwhelmed with suffering that I couldn't even live my life. And we're talking, this was in my early 20s. And it was right when I was trying to individuate and separate from my family. And so the suffering was so overwhelming that I went inwards, because the only thing I could figure out that would help in any way was to just go inside my mind and to assume the position of the witness. So I began doing that hours and hours a day. And then for the first time in my life, really, going deep and studying metaphysics and, different spiritual traditions. To make a long story short, after almost a couple of years of doing that very one-pointedly, very intensively, because from my point of view, I had no choice, I had a life-transforming spiritual awakening. I got hit by a bolt of lightning in my brain. It just ignited. Within hours, I went into such an extreme and altered state in which I was having the recognition that this is a collective dream. And then stuff began happening in my life that was completely physically impossible, or at least according to what I had been taught. And I was so ecstatic and enthusiastic of what I was realizing. In other words, that we're having a collective dream and we can help each other to wake up. From my friend's point of view, it was like I had had this radical personality change overnight. And so I immediately got brought by ambulance and put in a psych ward. And during that next couple years, I was, I got out of that psych ward really after 3 days. That's a whole story in and of itself. But there might have been 3, 4, 5 other times in that next couple of years I got thrown in psych wards and always diagnosed as having this newly discovered chemical imbalance. And the doctors were absolutely, they were reflecting back that I have this mental illness. I'll have it for the rest of my life. I'll need to be on medication the rest of my life. And as they were diagnosing me, I was busy diagnosing them as just being idiots, because I knew they had no idea what they were talking about, because it could not have been more clear to me inside my mind that I was having a spiritual awakening. And just finally, at first I thought, oh, I screwed this up by getting hospitalized. But then I began to realize, no, this was part of the awakening. It was like I was making a descent into the shamanic underworld. And being in psychiatry and having psychiatrists have power over me, that almost killed me. That almost drove me crazy. I could not believe the unbelievable abuse. And I'm happy to talk about that. But that I realize now, and for years, that was part of my initiation into the darkness.
What was your father
sorry.
like? Sorry, Rebecca.
I'm sorry.
I just want to know, while all this is unfolding and you're, through these years of treatment, psychiatry, and, this incredible awakening, was your father's behavior towards you getting worse?
No. It was consistent. I mean, he was taken over. He was an instrument for something, and his whole MO was to protect himself from being exposed. But then all of a sudden, as soon as I got into psychiatry, then my father had, he had the authorities confirming that, that I was the problem. I became the identified patient. So here I was the one trying to, shed light on the evil that was coming through my father, the abuse that he was playing out. But all of a sudden, as soon as I got certified and being told I was mentally ill, then he had all the cover he needed, because then it's like, oh, well, Paul's just mentally ill. This is part of his mental illness. So you see, then I began to realize that there was a whole field, a non-local field, that was configuring itself to protect the abuser. And here I was the one who had awareness, who was trying to shed light on the evil, on the darkness, on the abuse that was playing out. But what I didn't understand is, the field phenomena of then when somebody's bringing in light and exposing, or, trying to expose the darkness through its connection to the non-local field will then turn on the bringer of the light and make them the bad person, or make them the sick one or the crazy one. So you see, the whole thing was teaching me something. I was fortunate in that I was able to understand that something was being revealed to me of a higher order. And that's what's informed my whole body of work.
Did they ever put you on medication when you went into the psych?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what they did within the first minute.
Yeah.
And they were guaranteeing that I was going to be on medication for the rest of my life. And I remember at one point they put me on Haldol,
Yes,
the antipsychotic. And I remember, I'm a super creative person, because that's all of us. That's our nature. We're creative beings. And I remember thinking, wow, this is not an antipsychotic. This is an anti-creative. It just literally shut me down, and they were guaranteeing that I was going to need to be on medication till my dying breath, or I would have immediately a psychotic break. So a thing I want to point out, I just took myself off the medication as soon as I could, because I figured out then how to navigate being in consensus reality in a way that wouldn't freak people out. And so, I haven't been on medication, I don't know, since 83 or something like that. But the thing which is interesting, if I had subscribed to the psychiatrist's point of view that I was mentally ill and needed to be on medication, it would have killed me. And my whole life's work never would have happened. And I probably would have just killed myself. Or even if I didn't, I would have been dead spiritually. And from their point of view, that would have been a successful treatment. Now, there's something wrong with that picture.
Okay, I've had so many questions, and Sandy, I have to ask this, so please
Go ahead.
As we were saying before the program about my brother, who, quote, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, they put him on Haldol. I fought for so long because it made him so flat. He wasn't really the person that he was supposed he wanted to be. So finally they changed the medications. He went off of it, but he went back into those delusions. I even hate to use that word, but that's the best word that I can explain right now. And hallucinations, I understood what they were, but the medical field did not. And I don't believe my brother at that point really understood either. If I am a listener and I have a brother who has schizophrenia and they want to give him medication, but yet you know in your heart of hearts that he could ultimately do what you have done, how would you deal with that? I mean, how would you?
Right.
I mean, how would my brother be able to tap into the what?
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
So my answer to that is, unfortunately, so many people in the backwards of psychiatry are people who are potentially having shamanic initiatory spiritually awakening experiences. Indigenous cultures would recognize that. Typically, when somebody is called to their higher sort of this vocation of being a healer, a wounded healer, shaman, teacher, whatever you call it, artist, they, on the surface, it looks like they're having a psychotic break. So it'll look exactly the same as mental illness, but indigenous cultures will understand, oh, this person might be being called. That's like typical of people who are called for a higher vocation, is that their psyche, their constitution of their psyche is melting down so as to be reconstituted in a higher, coherent, sort of more integrated fashion. But in the West, that phenomena of being called to be a healer, shaman, whatever, is not recognized. Psychiatrists are just trained to pathologize. And the person in that state is in such a fragile, place and so vulnerable that when people of authority pathologize them, it will literally make them sick, which then confirms to the psychiatrist the truth of their diagnosis in a diabolical, self-reinforcing feedback loop. So the point is, to answer your question, if there are people in the family or the friends of the person who's going through that experience, and if they can recognize, oh, this person might be awakening or some deeper gift, because the whole shamanic trip, the archetype of the shaman is they go mad, ascend into the underworld, but if they don't get stuck there, they come back and they're able to bring gifts for the community.
Yes.
The result of that ordeal. And so if the family, the friends have the recognition that the person might not be mentally ill, because keep in mind, every spiritual awakening, I've never heard of one ever that isn't a combination, that isn't precipitated and catalyzed by emotional abuse, by trauma. Where, because that's the very thing that initiates the shamanic journey, because then the person gets split and they go in search of trying to find their disassociated part. So there's always a combination of healthy factors, the part that's awakening, and of the unhealthy factor of the abuse or the trauma or the wounding. That was definitely true for me. But instead of focusing on the pathology, which then will like invoke that person being pathological, like I was saying, if you actually are able to recognize the healthy part of that person that's awakening and relate to that part, that creates a bridge, that helps them to more incarnate and step in to the part of them that is awakening.
Yeah. I got one more question, Sandy, you can ask. Because as I said, I relate so much to what you're saying. Okay, I'm a listener and I hear this, and I've got a brother, a sister, or father, or mother, quote, diagnosed with psychosis or whatever, and they have a gun in their hand. Can you expand on that? What is that all about? Because, there are stories out there that they can.
No, okay. Absolutely. I understand. So in other words, the point is when somebody's having a spiritual awakening, it's like being under a spell and snapping out of a spell. So all of a sudden they're not connected to mainstream reality in the normal way. And it's important when you recognize somebody's going through that process to take care of them, to make sure they're not going to act out destructively towards others or towards themselves, because that's a real danger. Now, underlying that destructive impulse of having a gun and wanting to kill themselves or kill somebody else is the creative spirit. Because, in other words, what I'm pointing at in all of my work about evil and watico and a mind virus and all of the stuff we're talking about is that the medicine is to connect with the creative spirit. That's our nature, is to be creative. But if we repress that creativity, or if our culture oppresses our creativity, and then we internalize that oppression, so then we become our own control system, and then we don't express ourselves creatively, that same archetypal energy that would inform the highest, most sublime creativity gets transformed into destructive energy. So the constructive, creative energy becomes self or other destructive, and that's the danger. What that means is that the medicine is to like support the person in expressing what's going on for them inside of them creatively. That's the medicine.
Well, what you said there, I mean, the way society has been going for the last however many years is that it is becoming more, it's, you know, putting more and more constraints on our creativity. I mean, you look at kids in school, you know, they're not allowed to be creative. Teachers aren't allowed to be creative anymore. Everybody has to stick to a rigid curriculum. And it's as if our creativity is being forced out of us.
Yeah, yeah. And that's exactly right. And that's when I talk about the Wetiko mind virus, one of the major characteristics when Wetiko is in the house, and it's in the house of our species, is that it's not safe to express ourselves authentically. It's not safe to express ourselves creatively. And, because keep in mind, the Wetiko mind virus, it's a virus inside of the mind, but it actually, it enacts itself through the medium of the outside world. So what you just described, Sandy, the idea, or not the idea, the fact that our culture is suppressing creativity in both young kids and in everyone, that's a reflection of how Wetiko works in our mind. Because when there's abuse, like for me, the very experience that catalyzed my spiritual awakening was intense abuse from my father. And to be specific, he actually, when I was stepping into my creative voice that was separate from who he wanted me to be, he then, for perverse reasons, felt the urge to obliterate that impulse in me of expressing myself authentically and being my authentic self and expressing myself creatively. That process of him doing that externally became internalized in my mind. That was the suffering. That was what I had to deal with. And that's the way abuse works. Whenever abuse, be it in a family system or in a society, writ large in the global body politic, gets played out, we internalize it. And then we become, that's what I meant when I said we become our own control system. And that's when we're colluding with our own victimization and our own abuse. What I'm pointing at is shedding light on that process. And even though it's showing up out there in the world, it's actually enacting itself in our mind with our participation. And that's both bad news and it's good news, because the good news is that, oh my God, if we're doing it to ourselves, we can learn how to not do it.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, did it destroy your relationship with your mother too?
I had so I'm an only child. I had an incredibly loving, close relationship with my mother, as close to unconditional, whatever, like just love as you can imagine. And then as soon as this happened, when I had my awakening and became the identified patient and became pathologized, and my mother aligned with my father, protecting my father, then psychiatry supported, their point of view, my father's point of view, that I was the sick one. And basically what played out was that it completely destroyed my relationship with my mother. When she died in 99, we hardly even had a relationship. It was tragic. And then when my father died in 2002, then the whole rest of my family disowned me. I haven't really heard from them for 20 years because I was the one who was trying to shed light on the evil that was playing out, that all of them were colluding with by turning a blind eye. So yeah, that's the tragic part, and I've had to deal with that. And it was like in the petri dish of my family system, this poison got in, and that's the Wetiko mind virus. And you see, the thing about Wetiko, it's this diabolical energy. And etymologically, the word diabolic means that which separates. And here I was incredibly close with my mother. And by the time she died, we had no relationship. It's tragic, but all of that was teaching me. That's the point. Instead of feeling victimized by it, yeah, it's something I grieve every day, but I was fortunate enough to have the realization something was being shown to me through what was happening.
It was a lesson.
It was, and that's what informed all of my books.
Yeah, Wetiko can be a lesson.
So tell us,
Yeah.
where does Wetiko come from? How did it originate? Because it must have started somewhere.
Yeah, well, okay, so Wetiko is a Native American term. It's a psycho-spiritual disease of the soul. And every spiritual tradition from time immemorial is pointing at Wetiko. They don't use the word Wetiko, they'll have a different name or a symbol system. And, when I've thought about, in my books, I talk about, what is the origin? Was there like a collective trauma or a negative ET or God knows what? And I'd be interested in that. I don't know anybody who knows that. But what I point out is that Wetiko, it's actually recreating itself through us in this moment. So the salient point is that it's actually this energy, and it's this cannibalistic spirit. It's at the root of all of the evil that's playing out in the world, both within our own mind, in our relationships, collectively as a species. We're enacting it on the world stage. Wetiko is a collective psychosis, and we're completely in the middle of a collective psychosis. I'm assuming that everybody sees that. But the point is, we ourselves are participating in its regeneration each and every moment, to the extent we don't see it, because it feeds off of it operates through our unconscious, through the blind spot of our mind in such a way. It's a type of blindness that when we're afflicted with it, and we all potentially have it, when we're afflicted with Wetiko, we are suffering from a form of psychic blindness that actually believes it's sighted. And not only does it believe it's sighted, it believes it's more sighted than people who actually are sighted. Okay, so I can write. I mean, I have a book on Wetiko I wrote in 2013. I have another one coming out in a few weeks. I have another one coming out next year, and I've already started on my fourth book on Wetiko. It's the most important idea if we don't understand what it's showing us, and it doesn't have to be the word Wetiko. For example, in the apocryphal text of the Bible, they talk about this counterfeiting spirit that apes us, that imitates us, that puts us on. And if we identify with this limited, wounded version of ourselves, or this grandiose version of ourselves, but it presents to us a fictitious identity. And then as soon as we identify with that counterfeiting spirit, we've identified with who we're not, given ourselves away, and we've disconnected from our creative agency. And that's madness. And that's Wetiko, right there in a nutshell. And so, of course, I point out that counterfeiting spirit, it's in the apocryphal text. It's not in the Bible, because I point out that Wetiko was on the editorial board of the Bible. It made sure to take that reference out, because the point is that when we see how Wetiko works in the world and in our mind, it has no power over us. And then we become empowered.
But it is not a physical thing.
No.
It is not a living physical thing.
It's not. Wetiko doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as Wetiko. If people think, I should be afraid of this mind virus, no. That point of view, that is the way Wetiko is operating, by making you afraid. It feeds off of fear. It doesn't even exist. There's no such thing, and yet it can kill our species. That's the paradox, okay? Because it's not separate from our own mind. Now, Wetiko, it's so mind-blowing. It's a quantum phenomena. And I wrote a book about quantum physics as the medicine for Wetiko. What I mean by that is that Wetiko, it's a superposition of states. And what I mean by that is that it's both the source of the highest, the deepest, darkest evil, and the highest, most sublime creativity. encoded in the phenomena of Wetiko. And so it's like our unbelievably vast creative spirit is imprisoned in Wetiko. To the extent we don't see it, we're going to enact that creative spirit destructively, in which we're killing ourselves. And that's being shown by what's happening in the world. But if we recognize what Wetiko is revealing to us, we then unlock the most infinite creative spirit. And that's the medicine. That's the solution for the myriad world crises. I've been screaming on the rooftops for years about this. We already have the, the actual power. We have the gift. It's like we have this magic wand to heal what's happening in our world, but we don't know it. Or we know it, but we don't know how to use it. And it has to do with tapping into our creative spirit. Because here's the thing, when you have the realization of your nature, right, and you recognize your true nature, you realize, oh, my nature is creative. And then so you express yourself creatively. And the more you express yourself creatively, the more you know your nature. It's a positive feedback. And that's what's available to us, And if I could just say one more thing about how Wetiko works, it has no power over us whatsoever.
All right.
As long as we are identified with our true nature, it can't touch us. But what it does, it creates a simulation of ourselves. That's the counterfeiting spirit. It offers us this limited, wounded version of ourselves. As soon as we identify with that image of ourselves, then it has us. Then it can manipulate and control us. That's why it's so profoundly important to connect with our true nature, with who we actually are.
Let me ask you a quick question. Where are we on time?
Have to be very quick because then we have to go to break.
Okay, I'll ask it after the break. Is that
okay? We'll take a short break now. You're listening to Crack the Podcast, and this week we are speaking with teacher, healer, artist, Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and author Paul Levy. And we're talking about his books, which explore the nature of madness, evil, psychological and emotional abuse, and watico. And after the break, we'll hear more about whether watico is destroying us or waking us up. We'll be back in a few moments.
The Real Conscious Connection. Om Times Radio. IOM FM. Om Times Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Om Times, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of Om Times Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers, pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Worried about your friend but don't know how to reach out?
You could say how are you or get a fake tattoo. You can ask with an app if it works for you. You could chat with them in VR. It's so good. If you think you should check in, yeah, you should.
Whatever gets you talking.
Reach out to a friend about their mental health.
Whatever gets you talking.
Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back, Paul Levy. The question I would love to ask is, are you working with psychologists, psychotherapists, and in the medical field about Wetiko?
Yeah, no, I am. Like, it's interesting because, I have a whole community that's formed around my work, and I have a private practice and all these groups. And so many of the people who study with me are Jungian analysts or therapists or psychologists. And, and it's funny because if my parents were alive and if I were to tell them that, like they used to do when they were alive, they would just say, they would reflect back, that's my mental illness, that's my hallucination. And I would say, I would want to say to them, exactly, it is my hallucination because this is a dream. That's what I'm dreaming up. So yeah, no, it's sort of like the whole dream of 40 years ago, me being cast in the role of the crazy one, whereas I now have, so many therapists and healers, shamans, who study with me.
That's
It's
great. That's great.
it's interesting that there are so many authors now who are writing books, and scientists as well, who are saying that, in fact, we are co-creating all of this. How we think, how we behave is co-creating what we're experiencing. We're feeding the global mind and the global mind is feeding us.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true, but you have to be careful because I know a lot of, sort of new age spiritual people with the best of intentions who are like, oh, I'm creating my reality, and they're still talking out of this reference point to the ego. And that's an illusion. No, that's what you see through. Yeah, we're like co-creating reality with the universe because we're not separate from the universe, but it's not the egoic self that's co-creating that. It's some sort of higher self that we are actually the instruments for. And one of the things I'm trying to get across that was shown to me during my awakening in real explicit terms, actually in embodied form, is that, when we just offer ourselves to be in service to the whole, then all of a sudden we become conduits to help and catalyze the deeper healing that's like intrinsic, in the universe and thirsting to be actualized. We then become the instrument for that deeper healing to happen. So I'm actually pointing out that even though it's unbelievably scary and people get depressed and filled with pessimism and despair with all the darkness that's playing out, that it's actually that something is really made available to us right now. There's an incredible opportunity because as more and more of us are awakening to who we are as far as ourselves and in relation to each other, that we're not separate, when enough people have that realization, we can get in sync with each other and we can change the waking dream we're having. Because my whole work is based on that this is a dream. It's not metaphorically like a dream. No, this is a literal dream. And when enough of us wake up to that, that's what I began to realize when I had my awakening that got me in such deep trouble and got me hospitalized and diagnosed. But now I'm saying the exact same thing I was saying 40 years ago, but I've developed, I'm more articulate and I'm more skillful. But I'm basically saying, yeah, there's something, that's the good news. And my whole work is trying to get this out to people.
So, do you think there's a connection between the COVID-19 virus and Wetiko?
Oh, totally. In my next book, the one that comes out in a couple weeks, the last whole section of the book is exactly about that. And you see, the thing about Wetiko, it only has power over us to the extent we don't see it. And actually our turning away from it is the very thing that feeds it. That's how we're complicit in it. And I point out that the COVID epidemic, this physical actual virus, is a lower level emanation of the higher dimensional Wetiko virus. And I could go way into that for hours and hours. But the point is, there is a way of seeing, because COVID is not just a physical virus. To think that is limited. You think about how it's affecting every aspect of our lives and society and the economy and what we dream about and how we interact and what we wear and what we think about. It has multi-dimensional vectors of transmission. It's a spiritual virus, it's emotional, it's psychological, it's physical, it's etheric, it's astral. It has all these operational subtle bodies, and they all get channeled through our psyche. How we react to what's happening. Well, the psyche is the origin of Wetiko. And so the point is that there is a way, and this is what I talk about in my new book, there is a way of actually seeing the pandemic, COVID and the coronavirus, and to see what's happening in a way where it actually brings into focus the Wetiko mind virus. And as soon as you begin to see how it operates in the world and in your mind and in your reactions, then all of a sudden you become empowered and it unlocks this incredible creative force. So what I'm basically saying is that what's happening with the COVID epidemic is potentially helping us. But if we don't recognize what it's revealing to us, we'll take a look at all the destruction that it's getting enacted.
Can you give us some highlights in your new book about how you feel like that this COVID virus is waking us up?
Yeah, well, I mean, for an example, when the pandemic happened, so many people were saying to me, "Oh my God, this is like surreal," and I'm like, "Exactly. It's even more, it's easier now to recognize the dreamlike nature because things have gotten so trippy and so dreamlike and so surreal."
Yeah,
And then, for
true.
example, for me, when COVID happened, up until then, I would normally write an article every month, and I would spend the month crafting this article. As soon as COVID happened, I was writing a new article every day, and I was sending it out every day. And it's an example that, yes, some people just get, oh yeah, they just, indulge their habitual patterns and enact their addictions and, just zombie out and watch Netflix or eat or do drugs or drink or whatever. That's kind of tragic. But what's also available to us is take what's activated in us and how triggered we are and all the fear that's getting put out by the media and all the stress, and I'll chemically transform that into creativity, because locked in those negative emotions is the creative spirit. And so I'm trying to embody that and show people that, so just as some examples.
Well, that's interesting. And at the same time as all of this is happening and people are beginning to feel more creative and begin to notice this, we've also got this incredible situation, with technology where anything can be shared and instantly around the world. And people's minds are being hijacked by the very process by which that occurs, the constant short headlines that are going past our attention all of the time. So it's almost as if we're in this situation where on the one hand, we've got all of these forces that are trying to make that even worse. And on the other, you've also got people who are waking up and becoming more creative.
Yeah. Well, if I could just say, see, because what I'm particularly in my new book that's coming out, I'm trying to point out that watico has been articulated and symbolized by every spiritual tradition, from time immemorial, and by the most, genius creative thinkers and philosophers and artists, that our species has produced. Now, an example, Jung himself was completely switched on to watico, but he didn't know the name. And he called it a number of different names, but the one main name he referred to it as is totalitarian psychosis. Now, I just want to do a little commentary on that, because watico, it's a psycho-spiritual disease of the soul whose source is within our psyche, and yet it has a seemingly magical ability to extend itself out into the actual physical world and somehow coordinate events so as to express a psyche that's under its thrall. Now, just think about what I just described. It's an inner disease of the mind that actually is able to express itself through the medium of the outside world. Now, think about that. That's just like a dream where you recognize the outer world is actually reflecting the inner condition of the psyche. Now, getting back to totalitarian psychosis, here's how watico works. It hijacks our mind. Like you guys have been saying, it colonizes our mind. It will subsume all the healthy aspects of the psyche into its service to serve its pathology. It will set up a shadow government inside our psyche, dictate to the ego, and the person then compulsively acts it out, having no idea, because the immune system of the psyche gets captured. So it has no idea that it's actually acting out. It's like when you have a tapeworm in you and you start craving food that feeds the tapeworm, it grows bigger till it kills you. Well, but all the while you think you're feeding yourself. That's the way watico works inside of a psyche. But that tapeworm, it doesn't want to kill you too soon, or it'll suffer the inconvenience of having to find a new host. Now, that inner condition of watico, how it colonizes the psyche, sets up the shadow government, on and on, Think about what's playing out in the world, that there's these totalitarian forces that are, insidiously creeping over the planet and wanting to centralize power and control. That's an outer reflection of how watico works inside of the mind. When you see that, when you recognize that correlation, that's when you begin to recognize the dreamlike nature. And when you begin to recognize the dreamlike nature, that's when you're beginning to wake up. And that's when you're beginning to take away Watico's power over you, and you're connecting with your creative agency and power.
Okay, so say Wetiko starts coming over me. What tools would you give me to, I don't want to say block it, but recognize it? And because there are people who are very unconscious and don't recognize it. Say I'm one of those people who's very unconscious.
Yeah.
What
Well,
would
here's
you
the thing. We all, and Christ talks about this in the Bible when he talks about, something like Hugh cast the first stone, like to take a look at your own. We've all acted out our unconscious, and that's a very sort of simple way of describing who among us hasn't, like, at certain moments in time, every day maybe, get taken over by our unconscious and acted out. That's part of the human condition. And if anybody says, no, I'm switched on to Wetiko, I see it, I run the other way as fast as I can, because that's dangerous. The idea is until we become fully and utterly enlightened, and God only knows what even that means, we all have an unconscious. And so we all have the tendency to potentially be taken over by the unconscious and acted out. And the point is to develop a relationship with the unconscious. This is Jung's whole thing, to the ego self axis. In other words, his whole idea of therapy was to connect with the inner guide, with the daimon, with the genius, with our ally, with the muse, and get into relationship with that, and that will heal you. If you don't get into relationship with that inner genius, it constellates negatively and becomes a demon, and that's Wetiko. So what I'm pointing out is getting an intimate relationship with that part of us that's transcendent to our ego. That's the higher dimensional part of us. And the more you cultivate that, the more, it's like when you go to sleep at night. If you actually honor your unconscious and say, oh, please send me a dream or help me to wake up in the dream tonight, the unconscious, it's just a mirror. It just reflects back your attitude. So if you have that attitude towards it, it will then send you gifts through your dreams. It's exactly what I'm pointing at, that as we cultivate this attitude, and in Buddhism, one of the translations of enlightenment, Mahamudra, is the great attitude, also the great symbol. The symbols are the language of dreams. It's pointing at that the powers that be can oppress us and do everything, to like shut us down, but they can't do one thing. And that is it's our attitude. It's the way we interpret and place meaning on the world. It can't do anything. We're the one in charge of that. We're the authority in that. And Wetiko can't touch that. But it's tragic that some people just give that away, and that's when Wetiko really has them, because Wetiko, it can literally possess a person. It's a daimonic, transpersonal, archetypal energy that can possess a person or a group of people or a species, and they then unwittingly become the vector to act it out.
Well, we've seen that. I mean, we've all seen, television news coverage of people who, when you ask them why they've done a certain thing, they could have committed the most awful crime, but it's like they're blind to it. Sometimes they don't know. They're split off from themselves.
Yeah, and the thing about Wetiko, you see, it inspires us to act in ways that are against our best interest. And if people say to me, oh, what evidence do you have of this mind virus or whatever? And I just point out, well, just look at addictions or trauma, and it's really interesting when you study that. And I talk about this in my next book, because think about trauma. We become traumatized historically in a moment of time, and we're all in trauma. I don't know anybody who doesn't have PTSD. We're a species in trauma, right? I mean, that was the source of my whole process. I was deeply traumatized by my father. And then I got thrown into the medical system and they doubled the trauma. But think about what trauma is. When you suffer from trauma, the way you try to heal from the trauma actually regenerates the very trauma you're trying to heal from in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. That's the pathology of trauma, okay? But encoded in that process of the compulsion to repeat the trauma. Encoded, hidden within it is the medicine, because you're trying to consciously experience something. You're trying to discharge the energy that's bound up in the compulsion to recreate the trauma. And so that's really interesting. So trauma, like Wetiko, is a quantum phenomena, that it contains both the deepest pathology, but hidden within the pathology is the vaccine, is the medicine.
So I feel like that Watico's been around for hundreds and thousands of years.
Yeah.
I mean, just hearing you talk about it, I mean, it's because it's all energy, right?
Yeah.
Is it all energy?
Wetiko has been around from the moment that our species has arrived on the planet. Absolutely. But the thing is that it's now getting played out in our world and in our minds in a way that we can't avoid it. We can't avoid coming to terms with it, because it's this revelation. That's what I point out in my book coming out next year, that Wetiko is a revelation. And it's teaching us everything we need to know. It's catalyzing the evolution of our species. If Wetiko didn't exist, we would have to invent it. That's how important it is for our evolution. But if we don't recognize this positive aspect of it, then it just assumes it's programmed robotic response of killing us. And we're enacting that. We are enacting collective suicide on the world stage in so many ways, as if some sort of daimonic force has taken possession of our species. But what I'm pointing out again and again in as many ways as I can is that encoded in that process, it's actually showing us something. It's unlocking our creative spirit, but only if we recognize what it's revealing to us. If we don't recognize it, then we're fated to destroy ourselves.
I would think the awakened soul would definitely recognize it and try to be a light, towards healing and towards the Wetiko illness. I feel like that if enough people can recognize it, that we can wipe it out for the next 100
I wouldn't even say wipe it out, because that's, to me, not accurate. But I would say chemically transmute it, because think about Wetiko. It's like, all the wisdom traditions, Gnosticism, alchemy, they all talk about that imprisoned within the darkness is the light. The Kabbalah, the whole Kabbalah is about this. And the idea is that we play the role of actually freeing that spirit of light that's been imprisoned by the darker powers. So the idea being that, it's not like we eradicate Wetiko. No, there's nothing to eradicate. We actually plug into it and channel and transmute that energy into love, into creativity, into compassion. That's what's being offered to us.
Okay, so what is the first step? So say you say someone who says, okay, I've heard what you've said, and I can give it some credence. Now what do I do? What is the first step someone should take?
Right.
Yeah. Well, okay. I would say, you see, the way the shadow works, and the shadow, you could say, is the psychological aspect of Wetiko, is think about if you're possessed by the shadow, or if you're unconscious of the shadow, what do? You project it out. You disassociate from it. You try to eradicate it. And energy, like, think about it in a dream. If I'm in a dream and I have a shadow, and if I'm not consciously trying to look at it, what am I going to do? I'm going to project it out. And then the dream is going to supply evidence. People will come in the dream who have hooks, who, like, putting a coat on a hook. They will carry my projection. They will embody the shadow. And then I, of course, will then try to destroy them, which is just an externalization of the inner process of trying to destroy my own darkness. So then I'm actually enacting in the world the very inner process of trying to get rid of my own darkness instead of owning it and looking at it. So why I'm saying that is the first step is when we see, oh, this person is, evil, or has Wetiko, or is having darkness or shadow, is to recognize, wait a second, if this is a dream, they're just a dream character. They're reflecting back to me my own darkness. And what if I actually, instead of focusing, because Wetiko works by having us distract ourselves by putting our energy outside of ourselves. thinking the source of the problem and the solution is outside of ourselves, when the source and the solution is within our own psyche. So what I'm saying is, when you see the darkness, when somebody triggers you, instead of thinking, oh, the problem is that they're doing whatever they're doing, and if only they wouldn't do it, I wouldn't be triggered. No, that feeds watico. But if you understand they're triggering me and what inside of me is being touched, and you immediately self-reflect, then all of a sudden you have the opportunity to see on some unconscious shadow part of yourself, and that would be the first step.
And then what? So say I've done that and I see that. Now what do I do?
Then what? Then that darkness, that shadow, all of a sudden, as you own it and you recognize it, you're actually withdrawing your projection from the outside world. And you're taking more responsibility for your own darkness. And interestingly, think about a dream. If somebody in a dream is really owning their own darkness, then the dream isn't going to manifest with all the evil it does, because there's no need to do that, because the person is owning their own darkness. So what I'm saying is that what's happening on the world stage collectively is this dreamed up phenomena. Wetiko is a dreamed up phenomena. It's manifesting the way it is with such madness and evil, because each one of us are not owning our own darkness and our own light. And another way of understanding this, if I'm not owning my own creative agency, right? Think about a dream. If I'm in a dream and I'm not owning my own creative power, what's going to happen? The powers that be in the dream, the state, the power of the state is going to take my disowned power and use it against me, just like we're seeing in the world today. What that means is that for each one of us, for any of us to own our creative agency and own our creative power, that actually energetically has an effect on the deeper dream field. So we have this in each one of us. You see, we've been conditioned to think we're helpless and powerless and there's nothing we can do. The truth of the matter is, and quantum physics has showing us this. That's why I wrote my book. Each one of us have this unbelievably vast and unimaginable creative power and agency. And as any one of us wakes up to that and connects with other people who are also waking up to that, then all bets are off, because then we can change the dream. And that's not new age woo-woo thinking. That's like the most rigorous science. Quantum physics is showing us that.
It's very powerful. I mean, it's very it's simple but yet complicated.
Yeah.
It's on one hand it is like, for example, I'm not a physicist. Quantum physics seems very complicated, but it's the most simple thing, because quantum physics, and I want to announce this, is empirically showing, it's proving, and it's announcing this is a dream. That's what quantum physics has proven. Of course, the big controversy is, well, how do you interpret it? There's no doubt that, because quantum physics, everything it's empirically proving is showing the dreamlike nature, but a lot of physicists aren't trained to recognize that. So that's where the controversy is. What does it mean? But the real genius quantum physicists are saying, we won't understand quantum physics until we can essentialize it in a bumper sticker or on a t-shirt. And I'm pointing out that, okay, you want me to do that, or anybody to do it? What about life is but a dream? That's the essence of quantum physics. That's not complicated. That's very simple.
A t-shirt.
We're almost out of time, unfortunately. Very, very quickly, Paul, just tell us a little bit about Awakening the Dream community.
Yeah, so it's a community that's formed around my work. I've been doing these groups for over 25 years, and now there's been an international group that started, and I'm teaching a new class on Wetiko, I think in the February or March with Shift Network. And so there's more and more people who are plugging in to this. And the idea is, when we actually connect with other people who are also awakening, that's when we can really activate this incredible power that we already have. But we can't do it just individually. We need to recognize we're interdependent and interconnected. And when we get in sync with each other, then we can activate the power of our dreaming. And that's what the Awakening in the Dream community is all about.
Wow.
Well, we're doing it right here.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We're doing it right here. Do I have one quick question? Do I have time for one?
Quick, very quick.
Okay. Have y'all done studies on it and the results of people who have had, quote, psychosis and have done the Wetiko treatment? I'm not articulate because I feel pressed for time.
Well, I haven't done, there's no scientific studies, but I work with people all the time who are like really struggling. And when they connect with somebody who speaks the language and is fluent and has been through the experience themselves, that can be a game changer. Instead of just somebody who's gotten a PhD and read books and they don't have the experience. No, but I personally have know so many people who've been through seeming psychosis who actually then have been able to transmute it into the most incredible creative awakening process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow.
We have to close it down now, I'm afraid. Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. And for you at home, Paul is the author of several groundbreaking books. The ones we've been discussing today are Awakened by Darkness, When Evil Becomes Your Father, Dispelling Wetiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil, and Watico, Healing the Mind Virus That Plagues Our World. You can learn more about all of Paul's work at awakeninthedream.com. We'll be back at the same time 2 weeks from now. Till then, it's goodbye from me.
And me, Rebecca Shaper.
And remember, there is a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in.
Thank you, Paul.